The self can't be both the problem and the solution. Like all of us deal with these very real feelings of self-doubt and insecurity at times, and maybe even self-loathing. And the message of my book isn't that, well, you should feel bad about yourself and that's it. The message of my book is, look, you're not going to find the answer to those very real problems and feelings that you have in the same place where you're finding your problems and those bad feelings.
Hello, Classic crew, and welcome to today's episode of Let's Be Classic, where I'm interviewing Allie Beth Stuckey. Allie Beth Stuckey is a podcast host, commentator, speaker, and author. You might know her from her podcast, Relatable, and she started off her career as the Conservative Millennial. You guys are going to love our interview today. Allie is a Christian woman, so much of her work is informed by her faith, which I love, and of course, she is a conservative. So I hope you guys will enjoy today's video, but before we get into it, make sure that you are subscribed to my channel and hit that notification bell. And if you're interested in getting access to exclusive content not available anywhere else, including 4 exclusive videos every single month, make sure to subscribe to my Substack newsletter, which will come right to your inbox. Now, let's get into today's video. So thank you so much for joining me. I'm so glad that you could come on my channel.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So I have, a million questions for you, but we'll try to keep it somewhat contained. And I know that a lot of my subscribers and followers absolutely love what you do, so I'm sure they're going to get a kick out of what we're doing today. But my first question for you is, how did you become the Allie Beth Stuckey that we all know and love? And did you always know that this is what you wanted to do, that you wanted to speak out on conservatism?
So I vaguely knew that I wanted to do this. I've always loved the news. I can't say that I was super involved in politics when I was in high school or even college, maybe towards the latter part of college, but we didn't necessarily talk about politics sitting at the kitchen table or anything growing up. I was raised in a conservative Christian home, and so I was certainly instilled with conservative Christian values, and that was my worldview. Of course, my parents always voted Republican, and so I never went through a stage of, being some liberal or going through a feminist phase or anything like that. And I knew that I wanted to do something in media, but I didn't know exactly what that would look like. I have always liked speaking in front of people. I've always liked debate and things like that, but I just didn't know how those things would come together. I majored in communications in college, and I went into PR after college. And then about 2015, when the presidential primary was kind of gearing up, I kind of almost randomly just had this urge or had this idea to tell fellow young people that they needed to vote in the primary. And so I was working full time, but I remember calling my mom. I was driving to visit some friends in Atlanta. I lived in Athens, Georgia at the time. And I called her. I said, you know what? I think that I should go around to sororities in Athens and tell them why they should vote in the primary, like why it's important to care about the things that are going on. This was really the first election, not the first election I voted in, but the first election for me that I really felt like I knew what was going on and I knew what was at stake. And so I decided to reach out to sororities and ask if I could come tell their chapters why they should vote in the primary. And I tried to make it nonpartisan, but it was kind of obvious that I was conservative. And then that just kind of evolved into me having a platform doing the same thing, but from an explicitly conservative perspective. I started a blog, called it the Conservative Millennial. I did videos and posts and different kinds of, cultural, political commentary and things like that. Still working full time. Then in 2017, we moved and I joined The Blaze, actually not as an on-camera talent. I was actually doing like their social media in the hopes that I would, be on-camera talent at some point. And then it just kind of grew. I kept on blogging, kept on doing videos, kept on speaking different places, Republican organizations, telling them how to engage millennials. Millennials, they were what obviously Gen Z is now. Everyone was like, what's up with millennials? Millennials are so terrible. There are no conservative millennials. And so I tried to, take it upon myself as much as I could to try to educate the older generations about what millennials were thinking and why we were voting the way we were and all of that. And then, started doing TV. I remember when Fox News first called, and that was obviously a big deal. And then I started Relatable at, let's see, when was it? The beginning of 2018. So it's been about 3.5 years of doing that. So it's just kind of been a natural progression. And obviously I stopped doing PR and all of that full time in 2017 and started this full time. And I've just been very thankful that it's kind of just grown organically, and I've kind of just taken opportunities as they've come to me. And I do feel like this is what I always wanted to do growing up without realizing when I was growing up that this is what I would do or even wanted to do. So
I mean, clearly you've struck a nerve in the best possible way. You've been growing consistently since you started, and people love what you do. And people, like you said, you started relatable, and people feel that you are very relatable, which is awesome. But I recently read your book, which I loved. I actually listened to the audiobook. You're Not Enough, and That's Okay, Escaping the Toxic Culture of Self-Love. And I really loved it. I enjoyed every minute of it. So you write about how the self-love culture actually hurts more than it helps. You shared your own experience, which I loved. So can you tell us a little bit about how you knew you wanted to write about this topic specifically?
yes. So I am in the conservative, evangelical Christian world, which means that I have some crossover with people who are Christians or who are vaguely Christian or spiritual and kind of use Christian language, but don't have the same political perspectives or just kind of the same philosophical perspectives as I do, which means that there is a lot of disagreement and a lot of tension between professing progressive Christians and conservative Christians, not just when it comes to politics, because this really wasn't a political book, but specifically when it comes to theology. And one of the differences that I noticed was this replacement of Christ as the center of our understanding of the Bible and of life with the self, or really what I say in my book is exchanging the God of Scripture for the God of self, and kind of adopting this mentality that everything is about me. The Bible is about me. Life is about me. Life is about fulfilling myself, making myself happy, empowering myself, feeling good all of the time. And everything else, whether it's objective morality, whether it's objective truth, can be sacrificed on the altar of self-fulfillment, self-empowerment, etc. And I saw how damaging this was to women, not just to our theology, which obviously is of primary importance to me, but it was hurting their relationships. It was hurting their understanding of themselves, of other people, of work. This idea that we cut things out of our lives when they're uncomfortable or when society calls them toxic because they disagree with us or they don't suit us in that moment, that will leave us feeling empty. The whole premise of the book is that the self can't be both the problem and the solution. Like, all of us deal with these very real feelings of self-doubt and insecurity at times, and maybe even self-loathing. And the message of my book isn't that, well, you should feel bad about yourself and that's it. The message of my book is, look, you're not going to find the answer to those very real problems and feelings that you have in the same place where you're finding your problems and those bad feelings. So my encouragement is for people to look outside of themselves to find out the pressing questions that we're all struggling with, namely who we are, where we belong, why we're here, who made us, to look to the God who created us, and then also to look for ways to not focus on ourselves, but to forget about ourselves in service, in sacrifice, in hard work that isn't just necessarily serving us in our fame and our desires, but for the sake of sacrifice, for the sake of hard work, for the sake of doing good for other people, rather than constantly focusing on how we feel, what we think about ourselves, our self-identification and fulfillment. Ultimately, I just think that puts you on a hamster wheel and you're going to be exhausted trying to carry a burden that was never yours in the first place, which is one of trying to be your own God.
Yeah. No, I think, and it's so often you see this is I think especially pervasive in young women, which is why I think that your book was so kind of successful among women of this age group, is that we feel that we have to find meaning and fulfillment and purpose in kind of these paths that are not really going to lead to those things, right? So how to make yourself look the best for an Instagram photo, and if you don't feel that you have gotten enough likes that day, you don't have worth, instead of realizing that your worth is God-given.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And it's so ironic what you've just described, because the very people that I see kind of like finding their worth in how many likes they get on Instagram or different superficial things like that are the same ones saying that all they care about is self-love. All they care about is self-care. Oh, I find my worth inside myself. I'm self-confident, when really like their lives and their platform kind of contradict that. And we talk about this a little bit in the book. We talk about something called the paradox of perfection, which is these lifestyle gurus and authors and podcasters, influencers simultaneously telling you you're perfect the way that you are. You don't need to change anything about you. Anything that someone says is bad is actually just a quirk that they need to love. And if other people can accept you and all of your character flaws, then it has to do with them, not you. Those people are simultaneously telling you all of those things, that you're absolutely perfect. You don't need to change yourself, while also trying to sell you their book or their program that is going to change you, that is supposed to change how you think or how you behave. And so it's almost this way to reel people in and then make money off of people's insecurities. That, let me draw you in by telling you that you're perfect, you stranger that I've never seen in my life, and that you're smart and beautiful and capable and amazing mom, even though we don't know any of those things. You're perfect the way you are, but here's my book, here's my 10-step program, here's my podcast. It's actually going to change everything about you so that you can finally be really perfect. It's all a scam. And I think that's why when so many women, they read particular books from famous gurus or listen to their podcasts, they feel good for a little bit. It gives you a high to wake up in the morning and to look in the mirror and be like, wow, I am perfect. Or I am Beyonce and I can do everything. Girl power, girl boss, whatever it is. Not only could that damage your relationships, but also it's so fleeting. Like, if our confidence is dependent upon what we think about ourselves, then that's going to change based on our mood, based on what happened to us that day, based on what someone said to us, based on particular circumstances. There's a million different factors that could change how you feel about you. So if your confidence is dependent upon how you feel about you, you're going to be up and down. And I think that's why we see so many women chasing after like the next self-help book or the next motivational speaker, like the next program that is finally going to give them lasting joy, and it never does. And either they realize that, like they realize, okay, this is a dead end, I've got to find something more substantial, or they just keep on this exhausting road. And that's ultimately, that's why I wrote the book, because I don't want to see women exhausted by something that you don't need to be exhausted by.
Yeah, it's the project of self-love as opposed to self-improvement. Plus, on top of the self-improvement, right, is that, God loves you. I know that you talk about that a lot. We don't often talk that way so much in Judaism, but it is something that we believe, is that God does love you. And that, again, is what gives you worth. So self-love isn't an eternal project. The project needs to be growing and bettering yourself. And I mean, I think that is what gives people purpose over the course of a lifetime, is knowing that you are becoming better.
Right. And we talk about exactly what you just mentioned, that not only does your worth come from being made in the image of God, it comes from an identity that you can't even control. It's inherent in you. As a human being, you are made in God's image, and therefore your value and your worth is more than any plant, any animal, any other creature on earth. And that in itself is amazing. Of course, I'm a Christian, and so I believe that God showed his love for us in sending his son to die for our sins so we could be reconciled with him and live with him forever. Like, that is the gospel. That's what we believe sacrificial love is. And that's where we look. We look to the cross to tell us what our worth is, what our value is, not all of these contradictory thoughts inside of ourselves and how we feel that day, or whether or not we read the right motivational mantra on Instagram that morning, and you talk about the difference between self-love and self-improvement. Of course, I do believe that we shouldn't be down, like we shouldn't hate ourselves. We shouldn't be down on ourselves. We shouldn't be, constantly beating ourselves up. There are people who struggle with self-loathing, of course, but I argue that self-loathing and self-love or self-obsession are actually two sides of the same self-obsessed coin. So you can be over here and think that you are awesome, and then you can swing to the pendulum the next moment and think that you are the worst person ever. Really, what I think that we have to step away from is, again, that constant focus of how we feel about ourselves and what we think about ourselves, and to put our eyes on the God whose feelings about us and whose view of us as his children do not change. And as children, I'm talking about, I'm not, well, I won't even get into them. I won't even get into all the theological complexities of that statement. But as Christians in Christ, we believe that he has adopted us. And because of that, how he feels about us and what he sees us as does not change based on how we feel about ourselves. That is liberating. Like, that is freedom, that I don't have to define myself. I don't have to identify myself. I don't have to measure my worth based on how I feel. That burden is off my shoulders. And to me, that's really, really good news.
Yeah, I love that. So for all of the, young women who follow me who are religious, what advice do you have for them navigating this woke world?
Yes, so it's going to be increasingly difficult, I think, and I'm not someone who's trying to fearmonger. I understand people, people who aren't religious, they roll their eyes at, Christians especially, who talk about persecution in the United States. And I am very aware that any persecution that someone experiences, at least as a Christian in the United States, is not the same as what a Christian in China or in the Middle East is experiencing: torture, martyrdom, having to hide, they can't worship freely. But it is at least becoming more and more unpopular to be a Christian, to say things that we know are biblically true about whether it's abortion or sexuality or gender, all of these hot topics. This is going to sound like bad news, but it's actually freeing when you accept it, that you will be canceled for these things. You will be canceled for living out and speaking biblical truth. Like, the cancel mob will come for you in one way or another. And once you just accept that, then you can kind of stop this whole self-censoring madness and trying to stave off the mob as long as possible. They're coming. Like, unless you are ready to completely capitulate, unless you are ready to completely give up every value that you have as a Christian, unless you are ready to completely bow down at the altar of progressivism, the cancel mob is going to come for you. And so your options are to completely surrender or to double down. And I recommend the latter. I recommend that you double down on your values, that you are more bold than ever, that you're braver than ever, that you unabashedly shine light in the sphere of influences in which God has placed you. You are not placed here talking about time or talking about place arbitrarily or accidentally. You are placed where and when you have been with purpose. And just like every progressive that is totally unwilling and unashamed to push their values, whether it's in school, whether it's in your church, whether it's at work, whatever it is, you need to be just as unashamed to push your values in a kind and respectful way. Of course, I always say to try to raise a respectful ruckus when you see that things are wrong, or when things are brushing up against what you know to be good and right and true. So that's my encouragement. Know that cancellation is coming. And we also know that Christ talks about blessed are the persecuted. And I like to say, blessed are those who are canceled for Christ. I mean, you're going to be canceled. You're going to be canceled. And it's okay if you're canceled by the world. And so embrace that, double down. I heard someone say that courage begets courage. And I think about that all the time. Seeing one person stand up for something that you believe in, something that is, again, good and right and true, it allows other people to have that same courage. So be that person that is courageous enough to stand up and to allow that courage to be a contagion for other people.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I actually just recently spoke about this on my channel, that if you're the one who kind of cancels yourself in a sense, if you're the one who says, this is what I believe, this is what I stand up for that, then no one can actually come out of the woodwork and surprise you. It's kind of like, right. I already said it. You can't make me feel bad for something that I openly chose to say. So
right. It's almost harder. Like, you and I are obviously, we have platforms based on our beliefs. And so, like, I'm not going to get fired for being a conservative. That was literally why I was hired. It's almost safer to be out in the open, safer. I mean, in the sense that I'm not gonna lose my employment because I'm a conservative Christian. And it's a lot harder. Like, people, I don't know if people message you this, but people message me all the time, like, you're so brave for saying all these things. And I always want to say, no, you're so brave. You're so brave for posting the things that you do. You're so brave for sharing and talking about the things that you do, knowing that there is a real risk. There's a real risk because you are in a progressive circle, or you're in a progressive workplace. And the fact that you stood up to, your hiring manager or whatever it is about their new standards that you might not agree with, that shows way more courage, I think, than it takes for me to do what I do. So I just want to also sympathize with people out there who say, who are thinking, well, you don't know what it's like because I'm in XYZ situation. You're right. I don't. And I really respect the courage that people have in their everyday lives, knowing that there's real risk to standing up and speaking up for what you believe in.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I have kind of a little bit of experience because when I decided to change my channel in the sense of coming out, even though people hate when I say that, as conservative, I had to say, okay, well, I'm an opera singer. I'm probably not going to get hired for that anymore. But I also was moving into a new career trajectory, theoretically. So I was taking a step in a different direction.
Yeah, but that was definitely a risk. I mean, and that did take some courage to say that, okay, I'm going to risk maybe giving up this thing for this other thing. And I'm sure that was difficult to do.
Yeah, so that's why I totally understand the struggle that people have, especially if, you really do have that as an income, you need that to support your family. That does take courage. And I totally respect any of our followers who do that. And I think that at the end of the day, doing that is it just shows bravery, and it will, like you said, courage begets courage. And I totally agree. Yeah. So moving on to motherhood, you're a mom, which is lovely. Can you tell us a little bit about motherhood and your experience being a mom? Because I think so often young women are sold this lie that motherhood is a burden and it's terrible and it destroys your dreams, as many women will say in Hollywood when they're talking about their choice to have an abortion, for example. So I love hearing the positive things about motherhood from the women I have on my channel. So can you tell us a little bit about your experience as a mom?
Yes. In my book, we call it toxic mommy culture. And that is the online culture that is constantly talking about needing alcohol in order to get through the day, or that their kids are brats, or that they don't like their kids are so, badly behaved. And I am not ragging on jokes. Like, I understand that sometimes these people are trying to be lighthearted and maybe they're trying to commiserate, but I actually think, like, cumulatively, those kinds of jokes, they form this culture of resentment towards kids, and they foster this idea that your kids steal your identity, your kids steal your younger years, they ruin your body, and look, you sacrifice so much for these kids. How come they're not more grateful? How come they act this way? And a part of you dies when you have a child, and that just could not be more true. Not to be too new age sounding, but when you have a child, it almost feels like a rebirth for yourself, where like a new part of you is actually born. It's not that a part of you dies. It feels like a new part of you is born, this chamber of your heart of this deep, almost painful, unconditional love that you didn't even know was there just opens like the floodgates. And you realize that this person that you just met for the first time, you would do anything if it meant making that little person happy. All of the hopes and the fears that you had for yourself are immediately and all at once transferred on to that person. Every hope that you had for your own happiness, every hope that you had for your own success, every fear that you had that things wouldn't work out how you wanted them for yourself, now all of your hopes and your fears are wrapped up into this person's success and happiness and future and well-being. And that's an amazing feeling, not just because of what you feel for them and then what they feel for you. And as they grow, you see how much they love you and need you. And that's an amazing feeling, but also because it gives us a picture of how much God loves us. And I think the way that it opens our eyes to, oh, okay, God loves me that way. It really is that unconditional. He really would do anything for me. He really would chase after me if I turned away. I think about all the things that I would do for my child, and that there's nothing that they could ever do or say that would make me stop loving them. And you realize that, and as Christians, we believe it's God through Christ loves us that much. Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing. And so any kind of like talk about motherhood, like a part of you dying or a part of you going away, I can't relate. I can't relate. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not hard. That doesn't mean that there aren't sacrifices and that you're not tired and that you don't give up things that maybe you wanted to do. There are plenty of things that I used to do before my kids were born that I just can't do now. I don't have time now. And so, sure, you could call that a sacrifice, and that's fine. There are days and nights when it's really hard. Every mother can relate to that. But I also remember what precious gifts they are and what a privilege it is to be able to steward them and to steward their lives. There are a lot of women, and this is also something that bothers me so much about toxic mommy culture. There's so many women and men who have been trying to have children for a very long time, have not been able to do that. They would give anything to be waking up five times a night. They would give anything to be putting, a Band-Aid on a scrape, or to be asked why 1,000 times in one afternoon. They would give anything for that. And then when toxic mommy culture on Instagram makes it seem like this is it's just so trivial, it's just so annoying, and it's just so much of a burden, my heart breaks for those people who see that and would give anything to feel that, would give anything to make those sacrifices. And so being a mom is amazing. Don't buy the lie that you have to have all of your ducks in a row before you have kids. Like, I understand that mentality. I had that mentality that I want to travel to this place. I want to do this. I want to, check these things off on my, list of career goals before I have a kid. And while it's fine to have goals, and maybe you need to save up money or you need to graduate, I understand there are different things in life, but don't buy into the lie that you have to wait and wait and wait and do all the things that you've ever wanted to do before you have a kid. That mentality, I don't think is healthy. It's also, from my perspective, it's not biblical. It's not biblical. We don't see that kind of precedent in the Bible. Every time we see God talking about childbirth or talking about raising children, it's always shown as a blessing. It's always shown as a very good thing, as a gracious blessing. And I think that we need to have that mentality towards children, and then maybe the birth rate wouldn't be declining so rapidly if we were a little bit more positive about what it means to be a mom and dad.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything you just said, from top to bottom. I don't even know that I have much to add. I mean, I'm not a mom yet. I would love to be a mom. My husband and I, people know we had a loss earlier this year, but
I'm so sorry.
It's part of the reason why I say, don't wait until your ducks are all in a row, because you think you have control and you don't. And, there was a small element of that for us where I wanted us to be settled just a little bit more before we started trying. Thank God, when we tried, it was easy, but then we did have a miscarriage, and now we're, paused a little bit. So it's not like you can immediately say, okay, we're ready to start trying and we're going to get pregnant right away, because you don't know. Yeah. And I think that that's another, a big problem that's, sold to women, is like, things are going to happen on your schedule. Nothing happens on your schedule. God is the one who plans everything.
Yeah. So. Yeah, exactly. And that can be really hard. And it's helpful to have that faith in God's sovereignty. Because yeah, I think that we all just kind of assume no one ever thinks that they're going to go through either infertility. No one ever thinks that they're going to have a miscarriage or that their pregnancy is going to be hard or that birth is going to be really hard. I mean, I've talked about on my podcast that my first birth and even my second birth, they didn't go the way I planned. They didn't, I mean, thankfully, thank the Lord, I have two healthy babies and I'm so happy about that. But you can prepare and do everything and do all of the research, whether it's conception, whether it's pregnancy, or whether it's birth. And there's so many things beyond our control. That's absolutely true.
Yes. And I think that, remembering that things are in God's hands can actually put you a little bit more at ease about starting to try and having babies and all of that. But when you were, ready to be a mom, and did you read any books during pregnancy or now, having been a mom, like reading books about parenting, not just pregnancy, that you would recommend?
Okay, I know that I should have a list of parenting books and pregnancy books that I have read, but I honestly haven't. And that's not because I don't recommend them. It's just that I haven't. I the first couple years I feel like, and should be comforting to people who don't yet have kids, and maybe you have the mentality of like, oh my gosh, I have no idea what I'm doing. You will be amazed at how much of it is intuitive. But I'm starting to get into those years of, my oldest is 2, of thinking, okay, well, I haven't even had to think about, discipline, or I haven't even had to think about really like, okay, how do I say no? How do I incentivize good behavior? How do I try to, teach her how to kindly and politely share and interact with other kids? Because when they're babies, it's just kind of natural, like what to do and how to help them and all of that. As they get older and they start to be more willful, you kind of have to learn tactics. And I think that this is where I am starting to have to get a lot of wisdom from other people who have gone before me. Sometimes I listen to podcasts, but I don't necessarily have a whole lot of parenting books specifically to recommend. I did do the whole classic, like what to expect when you're expecting, which I know a lot of people rag on that book, but good. I mean, I think it's actually good to understand. I realized before I got pregnant, I didn't know a lot about pregnancy and about gestation and about birth. I just had no idea. And I wish I would have researched more during my first pregnancy. That is some advice that I will give to people, that you should do a lot of research. You should do a lot of research about pregnancy, what you should be doing and eating, and how you should exercise during pregnancy, not to put too much pressure on you, not to put too much pressure, but to just kind of have some knowledge. And then you should research, birth, where you want to birth. You shouldn't necessarily just automatically assume that you want to give birth in a hospital. You might not want to give birth in a hospital. If you want to get induced, if you want to have a C-section, all that stuff, I had no idea that I needed to know anything about before I gave birth. And I wish that I had in my first pregnancy. But again, not to overwhelm people, because birth is natural. It's not a medical procedure, but it is good to know all of your options and that you're in authority when it comes to birth and labor and all of that stuff, because I have seen a lot of women, unfortunately, kind of taken advantage of in those kind of situations. And I guess it's because I just gave birth that I am very passionate about this right now. But yeah, that's one recommendation that I would give, just to make sure that you are educated. When I start to educate myself a little bit more on how to parent toddlers and, older kids, I'll come back on and I'll give some book recommendations.
Well, I actually think it's nice that you didn't have a ton of recommendations for the beginning, because I think there is this fear going into motherhood of like, I need to read every single thing so I'm prepared. And knowing that there's just a natural instinct that takes over is comforting. It's nice to know.
Yes, there definitely is. And you will surprise yourself. And I remember a friend gave me a piece of advice, which I think is true, that if you don't know how to do something, or you don't know, you don't know what's going on, how do I deal with this thing that my newborn is doing or whatever, give yourself 24 hours and you will figure it out. Obviously, save like some kind of like emergency, obviously call your pediatrician. But I'm just talking about like, oh my gosh, my child won't go down for a nap, or my child keeps waking up 6 times in an hour. Give yourself 24 hours and let people help you. get advice from other people. That is a huge tip that I would give. Give it advice from well-meaning people that you trust and that you love. And you will figure it out. You will figure it out. And then your second child, you have so much confidence because you're like, okay, I know that I can take care of a child and that they're going to be fine. You just feel a lot more confident and a lot less stressed out. So just take a deep breath. It will be fine. God has totally equipped you to be a mom. He totally 100% has.
I love that. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about beauty and fashion. So I'm actually curious. I didn't actually think about asking you this, in advance, but I'm curious about your thoughts on modesty. Do you have any thoughts about, women dressing modestly in the modern age?
This is such a hot topic. And I know that you talk about this a lot, and I really appreciate that because I think most people that are having this conversation are within like evangelical Christianity. I feel like those are the only people that I ever know talking about this. And this is like a whole subculture that you might not be totally familiar with, but there's also like this ex-evangelical movement that they grew up in what they call purity culture, that they feel like was very sex negative and basically put the onus on women to try to, stave off temptation for men and all of that stuff, which I agree can actually be toxic. And I talk about on my podcast. There were certainly toxic things that I learned and read about sex and about the female body and about modesty and things like that growing up. But I also don't think it's right to swing the pendulum in the other direction and to say, well, as promiscuous as you want to be, however you want to dress is totally acceptable, at least not from a Christian perspective. The Bible is really clear that our body, it's a temple of the Holy Spirit. It's a dwelling place for the Holy Spirit, that we were bought with a price, that our body is not our own. So while I do think modesty can be, obviously it can be subjective in a lot of ways. Like there's not this standard, there's not really like an objective standard that God says in the Bible that your neckline has to be this high or your skirt has to be this long or you can't wear a tank top or something like that. And so that's why I think it's a little bit of a tricky subject, because it's something that I think starts on the inside and works itself outward rather than the other way around, because it's not just some kind of legalistic set of standards. It is about, in all things for the Christian, glorifying God and loving him with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength. And our intentions behind what we wear and how we present ourselves are supposed to reflect a desire to glorify God. Now, that does have some standards, obviously, like it can't just be, okay, yeah, modesty is whatever you want it to be. But I guess I have a hard time saying, okay, this is exactly what it is. Beyond, okay, are you looking to glorify God with what you're wearing, or are you looking to get attention? Are you looking to provoke to provoke some kind of reaction, or are you looking to glorify God? So I think that's where it starts. Now, I haven't worked out exactly what the rules are for where it ends. But those are, I would guess, my initial thoughts just kind of on this whole controversial topic of modesty. Modesty is important, I think, both internally and externally. But how exactly it looks like for every single person, that's going to be a very hard one-size-fits-all standard to apply, I think.
Yeah, I try to be, somewhat flexible with my definition of modesty, because from an Orthodox Jewish perspective, we actually do have rules of covering your shoulders, for example, covering your cleavage, wearing skirts that come below the knee. I mean, they're very strict rules, ones that I took a few steps back from and I'm now working my way back towards, just because that's my faith.
Oh, interesting.
But
yeah.
I also believe that, not everyone needs to keep the exact same rules that I do. I think that there are just some specific things that we should do, right? So I try to encourage people, not to show a ton of cleavage. I try to encourage women not to wear skirts that you're going to see everything when someone bends over, that kind of thing. But I try to say, it's not that it has to be entirely strict. It's that there are certain certain things you want to try and keep in mind, and there are certain standards that we should keep. But again, those are flexible because you think about in Indian culture, their midriffs are often exposed when they wear a sari. And that is entirely appropriate. In America and Western culture, it's kind of coming into fashion to do that, but I wouldn't say that it's like a modest choice. So it is a little bit of a different mindset depending on where you are in the world.
It's almost, I think that those are good, that's a good kind of starting place, what you laid out, and a good mentality to have about it. It's almost like the definition, the legal definition of obscenity. Like, you can't define it, but you know it when you see it. It's a little bit the same, not completely, but it's a little bit the same about modesty. Like, it's hard to define for every single person, but you know it when you see it. Now, your brother and I had a disagreement about this on his show, actually, because, and I think that he is right. I've maybe come around, but I have never thought about leggings as inappropriate or immodest. I used to actually teach bar classes, and so it was just a part of my everyday attire. But I forget what he said on his show, but basically he argued with me about it and said that leggings aren't pants, they shouldn't be worn without something over it. And of course I had a lot of fellow Christians reach out to me and say, Ben is right and you should be in line with him on this. And I think that it's probably true. So
one of the most popular blog posts I ever wrote was a few years ago. I don't know if you remember this. A Catholic woman wrote an article about to the college newspaper, saying that she had seen a couple of girls come into church wearing leggings and crop tops, and she just wished that women were a little bit more modest generally, but also within a church setting. And people were ragging on her about it, saying it was horrible. And I wrote in this blog post, actually, I think she might be right. This is something I've talked a lot about with my husband, because initially I had the same feeling that you used to have of, what's the problem? They're just leggings. And then I realized, the excuse for wearing leggings, despite the fact that they are, in my opinion, actually not very modest because they show so much, is that either it's fashionable or they're comfortable. But if they're comfortable, you can just wear sweatpants. And if you don't want to wear sweatpants because they're not fashionable, then you're wearing them because they're fashionable. You're wearing leggings because they're fashionable. So it's kind of cyclical. So yeah.
I think that's a really good way to explain the logic behind it, and to challenge someone who, like me, just never really saw anything wrong with it. But I think in a lot of things, whether it comes to modesty or anything, there are so many things that we accept or that are normal for us that we don't think about until someone challenges on us on it, like you just did, and kind of push and prod a little bit about our thinking, because chances are we're just not thinking about it. But I think what you just did, kind of asking that question, is a really good way, without getting people to be defensive. It's a really good way to just get people to consider. And maybe that's just kind of a good standard, what you just laid out for modesty in general. And it kind of goes back to what I said too. So we agree, why am I wearing this? Why am I wearing this? What is the point? And I always ask myself, which this is, it can be hard. Okay, I don't like what this shirt looks like with a tank top underneath it. Okay, well, what's my reasoning for not wearing a tank top underneath it? I know that it's more modest with the tank top, but I'm not wearing a tank top underneath it because I like how it looks. Well, that's not necessarily a good enough reason to not be as modest as I can. And so I do find myself having that conversation of I really like how this looks without this, but I know that it's more modest with it. So am I actually going to be okay with consciously making the decision to be less modest than I could be? So yeah, I think that's a good kind of line of questioning that you laid out for people to think about that for themselves.
Yeah, well, I'm glad I got to talk about modesty on my channel. I actually haven't had a chance to chat about this with anyone else. I'm usually just talking to my camera and putting it out on the internet. So it's nice to actually have it as a conversation.
Yes, for sure.
So I feel like we should probably start wrapping up. I just have a couple more questions. One is about dating and relationships. I know you talk about this a lot on your podcast, but what advice do you have for young women who are dating, and I would assume the ones who are following me, dating for marriage.
Yes. And so I do recommend dating for marriage. I think a lot of women probably who are watching this aren't trying to waste their time just going through a bunch of, you know, flings and short-lived unhealthy relationships. So we probably don't even have to go down that path. One thing that I would say that I don't know is necessarily said that much, especially within Christian circles, because the emphasis is so much on marriage, which I think it should be. Marriage is beautiful and a wonderful goal to have. But I I think that there are some Christians who would say, as long as you find another Christian, as long as you find a Christian man that has generally your same values, then you don't have to worry about anything else, and you should just marry them. Because if you're trying to, not have sex before you get married, which is part of, the Christian sexual ethic, then you just need to get married to make sure that you don't fall into that temptation. And some people have made that decision and they've gone on to have beautiful and wonderful marriages. And I definitely can't knock that. From my experience, I think that it is so important to feel that feeling of, yes, I want to be with this person, because I had dated people who checked all the boxes, who were Christian, had the same values, and, you could have gotten married and maybe it would have been fine. But I never felt like, oh, I want to spend the rest of my life with this person. I love this person. There was always a feeling of something's not right and I don't know what it is. But when I met my now husband, I just knew. I knew pretty immediately, which is not everyone's experience, and that's fine. But I knew at some point that, okay, without a shadow of a doubt, I want to be with this person forever, and you almost can't put your finger on it. Yes, of course, you're physically attracted to them. You think they're funny. You like some of the same things. You click, but there's almost always like this intangible thing that you just love about that person. And what I would say is, if anyone, say you are married or you're engaged, not married, but engaged or dating, and you're having these like doubts just inside your head that you can't make go away, that you keep pushing down because you're like, no, this person's a Christian, he's a good guy, and I just have to get married. You don't. You do not want to be married and sad. It is better to be single than sad than to be married and sad because you didn't listen to whatever it was, to the conviction of the Holy Spirit telling you that this is not the right person. I'm so glad that I listened to that and then ended up marrying the person I was supposed to be married to. But I don't want young women who value marriage rightly and who want to be married rightly. I don't want you to rush into anything or to pressure yourself into marrying someone just because they look good on paper if you don't love them. A beautiful thing about being alive today in the West is that we can like and love the person that we get married to. We don't have to marry someone that we don't love and like. And that romantic love, C.S. Lewis talks about it a lot, is important. It's not going to be the same kind. You're not going to have the same kind of feeling that you did, when you were dating someone, but it's a better and more lasting and a stronger love that develops throughout marriage that you actually work on and work through. But that romantic love in the beginning, that really liking that person, that can't eat, can't sleep, I think that's important.
No, I totally agree. I actually talk about this on my channel all the time. The idea that chemistry and compatibility, people talk about that all the time, but really it matters. You need to have both parts of that recipe. And just having compatibility, I've dated those guys and it is nice, but then you don't feel anything deeper than that. And when you break up with them, often it's not like you're heartbroken. You just question it because you were like, well, we were so good on paper. And that's not when you break up with someone, I don't think that's how you would know it was the right person, is like, oh, it was so good on paper.
Yes, chemistry versus compatibility is a great summation of what I was talking about. Absolutely.
And so last question is work-life balance. I think all women, we're all looking for a way to balance all this, right? Balance being mothers, balance being wives, balance work. So do you have any tips? Do you have any recommendations or any life experience that you could share?
Yes. So you can't be a full-time employee or entrepreneur, worker, whatever it is, you can't work full time and be a full time mom. You can't. Something's got to give. Like right now, to do this podcast, there's something that I'm not doing to do this podcast, and or I would have not done this podcast to do something else. Like life is about choices. You're making a choice every minute, every hour to do one thing, which necessarily means you're not doing another thing. And that's okay. Like there are some things that are important for you to be at and for you absolutely not to miss. You are the only person that can do a certain thing for your child or for your husband or whatever. And you have to prioritize that and fill that role well. And there are other things that are movable. There are other things that are more flexible. There are other things that can wait a little bit and that you can get to a little bit later so you can do this one thing. There are all different kinds of working moms. Of course, I'm very thankful that I have a job that is pretty flexible, that I can kind of choose my schedule and that I'm not working in an office 40 hours a week. There are some moms that do that. I will say most of the friends that I have who, they worked kind of the classic 40-hour job and they had a child and they swore it would never be them that they would stop working full time. But then that just internal tug, that internal turmoil that women feel naturally, it's not society, it's not the patriarchy, it is natural, that pull to be with your child and to be home. That doesn't mean that they will never work again. That doesn't mean that they don't work at all in any way. It does mean that at least for right now, and in some ways, they are deciding to prioritize being at home and they find other ways to work. And that's what I feel like I do. My priority is to be a wife and a mom. I fit my podcast, I fit interviews like this, I fit my book into that rather than the other way around. And I do feel like, I can do both. Some days are harder than others. Some days can be really difficult. Some days you don't know which one you should do and at what time. And that's okay. You learn as you go. Lean on people for help. Hopefully your spouse is very present and is very engaged and is very helpful. My husband very much is. And he is actually, since the whole COVID thing, he's been working from home for like a year and a half, which has been super helpful. I know not everyone has that, but take advantage of the help that people are willing to give you. And you'll figure it out as you go. And if you do decide, if you have a job that you love, but you can't do like the full-time mom and full-time work thing, if you quit, one, you will figure it out then, but you'll also figure it out in the future if you want to work again. There are seasons of motherhood, just like there are seasons of life. And you might not have to stay home full time in a few years once they're in school. And it's just how it goes. It's up and down and back and forth and different sacrifices in different seasons. And I'm still very new at all of this. And so I'm learning this as well. But yeah, that's what I would say. It's not as cut and dry as either you're a full-time mom or a full-time employee. There are ways in the 21st century to make both work. You just have to decide what your priorities are.
I love that. I love that. And it's all about flexibility, which is what I totally got from what you were saying. So that's awesome. And on that note, thank you so much for coming on my channel.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, if you could just let everyone know where they can find you.
Yeah, so I host a podcast called Relatable. We talk about culture, theology, news, sometimes politics from a Christian conservative perspective. 4 times a week, Monday through Thursday, wherever you get your podcast. You can also watch on my YouTube channel. I'm on Instagram, Twitter, all that good stuff. You can just kind of, I guess, search Allie Beth Stuckey. I'll probably pop up.
Perfect. Thank you so much again. And I hope I can have you on in the future.
Thanks, Abby. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know in the comments what you guys thought. I'd love to hear. Make sure that you are subscribed to my channel and hit that notification bell. If you're not already subscribed to my Substack newsletter to get exclusive content not available anywhere else, make sure to head to the link in the description box because you can do so there. And I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye!